Okay, hello everybody. Welcome to the New York Transit Museum. My name is Hillary and I'm the Public Programs Coordinator at the museum. If you haven't been to the museum, it's a time to make plans for a visit. We're located in downtown Brooklyn in a decommissioned I&D subway station. We're open from Thursday through Sunday from 10 a.m. to 4 p.m. We also have a gallery and shop in Grand Central Terminal with a new exhibit, Telling Transit Stories. We're actually having a free virtual exhibit walkthrough next Tuesday, May 21st at 2 p.m. You can register for that on our website. For today's program, if you'd like captions, you can go to either hit the caption button at the bottom of your screen, or you can click the three dots at the bottom of your screen, click captions, and then say select show captions. We will be leaving time for questions at the end, but feel free to add them to the chat during the presentation and I will share them out at the end. Okay. Today, I am very honored to introduce our presenter, Veronica Davis. She is a self-described transportation nerd, which puts her in very good company here. She is the author of Inclusive Transportation, a manifesto for repairing divided communities, which she will be presenting from this evening. We're going to put a link in the chat so you can purchase your copy directly from the museum store. Veronica is currently a director of the director of the city's program for Atkins Realis. She has over 20 years of experience in civil engineering and planning. Under the Mayor Turner administration, she was the director of transportation and draining operations for the city of Houston. She is also the co-founder and former managing partner at Inspire Green LLC. She is one of the co-founders of Black Women Bike, and she was the vice president and City of Houston representative on the National Association of City Transportation Officials. She has a dual master's degrees in engineering management and regional planning from Cornell. And in July 2012, she was recognized by the White House as a champion of change and transportation innovator for her professional and community advocacy efforts. That is quite a resume. Now I will hand it over to Veronica.
Thank you so much, Hillary. And thank you to the New York Transit Museum for inviting me. I've been working with Amy and Hillary for months now. And so it's great to be here this evening. Next slide. I want to just give one quick kind of caveat. I am purchasing a house in Baltimore, so my husband got stuck there. So I am solo parenting, so you may hear a little squeaky voice off to the side, but that is life and we keep moving on. So this is my information. My social media is, as long as Elon Musk doesn't break Twitter, is at Veronica O. Davis. And then my personal website is veronicao.com. Next slide. I always like to give a little bit more about me. I know that there's the speaker's bios and where I went to school and my degrees and where I work, but a little bit more about who I am as a person. This is a photo of Maplewood, New Jersey. I know there's a lot of New York people on here. And so if you have no idea where Maplewood, New Jersey is, you get on New Jersey Transit from Madison Square Garden, Penn Station, and take the Dover line. And Maplewood, New Jersey will be off of the Dover line. But it really was a great place to grow up, a very walkable community, a very child-centric community. And so it really shapes who I am, what I think about. The fact that as even kids as young as 5 years old walk to school by themselves, because it was just that safe. I don't know if they do it now or not, but that's at least what we did growing up. Next slide. One of the things about me, I'm the co-founder of Black Women Bike. I always joke, I actually don't really like biking that much, for exercise, that is. I actually got into biking because when I started my company, I was looking at ways to lower my cost of living. And we know that owning a vehicle is very expensive. At the time I was living in the District of Columbia, and they, one thing about DC is that you will get a parking ticket. And so that also added into my cost of car ownership. And so I actually ended up giving up my car for a bicycle to be able to lower my costs. And so with that, this whole movement came about, and really Black Women Bike was about getting women on bicycles for fun, for transportation, exercise for those that want to do it. And so this is just a photo of some of us after a ride. Next slide. As mentioned, I was the director of transportation and drainage operations for the city of Houston. In January of this year, this headline from the Houston Chronicle talks about my departure from City Hall. And so, yes, whenever you have a change of administration, some people get thanked for their service. But it was really great to work under the Turner administration, very forward thinking and real stalwart in being able to have a vision and continue to move that vision forward. Next slide. But don't cry for me, Argentina. I spent about 2 months on a much needed sabbatical, which was great. And I spent that time walking around different parts of the city to experience. We have a really great trail system in Houston where they originally were envisioned as recreation, but they have now become trails that are both recreation and transportation. And so this is just me being that strange lady on next door, walking around, smiling and singing. Because that's life. Next slide. And so this is for my book. I know the link was shared in the chat, and I hope that you all decide to click the link and purchase. But this is just a quick overview of what's in the book. The forward is by Tamika Butler, a good friend of mine who lives in the Los Angeles area. That just really frames the book and frames why this is an important book at this moment in time in the transportation industry. And the preface, I give a little bit about my feelings as an author because I am an engineer, and a lot of engineers don't like to write, and some engineers can't write. So it was just my experience of what it was like to write a book. In the introduction, this is really important for those that may be listening that aren't in the transportation world. I try to provide a framework, a very short history for the transportation industry, where we are right now. How we got to where we are in terms of designing wide roads where we know that people are being seriously injured and killed. Looking at how technology is integrated and has an opportunity to be useful if we also retrain our thinking. So that's what the introduction is. And I have 5 main chapters. Each chapter is structured to give an idea, give a case study, something that I've worked on or something that someone else has worked on that I'm very familiar with. But then I end each chapter with some work. And so whether you are in this industry or you're just interested in the industry, there really is something for everyone in here. If you are I just like trains, you can look at chapter 1, which is transportation is personal, even opportunities in chapters. And then lastly is a call to action to help for different things. And so for this particular talk, I'll talk a little bit about transportation is personal. And I always like to leave with a call to action. Next slide. So this is a little bit about why I do what I do. This is a ghost bike. And for those of you that aren't familiar, it is generally put up after a cyclist is killed in a traffic related incident. And this ghost bike happens to be one of my friends who was struck and killed on April 19th, 2019. And so right last year, over 44,000 people were killed in motor-related fatalities. We do know these are all preventable. And so this is just why I'm passionate about this work. Next slide. And so this is a very hard to read slide, but really this is the leading cause of death of children, basically from age 1 to 19 in the United States. This goes up through the year 2020. The crazy thing about this whole graph is that motor vehicle crash related fatalities are going down a little bit with children. And the only reason why it wasn't number 1 in 2020 for the first time is because of firearm related injuries. And so when we look at our children, we do know that the two reasons why our children are dying are both preventable. Next slide. This is a slide. And so for those of you that haven't seen this before, this was put out by the Institute of Transportation Engineers. And I know that sometimes when we talk about traffic related deaths and fatalities, we get into things like driving under the influence and all of these things. And those are contributing factors. But we know that speed really the base of it is the thing that is a contributing factor. And so what this slide shows is at different speeds, if a person driving hits a pedestrian, the probability or the percentage of that the person will survive the collision. And so at 20 miles an hour, 90% of people will survive the collision. At 40 miles an hour, it drops to 20%. However, next slide, that is based on a sedan. And what we know is our vehicles have gotten bigger and our vehicles have gotten heavier. And so this is just what they call the blind zone test. So at the narrowest is a Toyota Camry, which is a typical sedan. So if a person is sitting in their vehicle and sitting all the way back, they can see about 3 feet in front of their car. If they're in a Cadillac Escalade, they can only see 10 feet in front of the hood of their car. And the next slide really drives this home for me. It was a picture that I found that talks about the blind zone. And so this is 12 children that are sitting down. So if a person is sitting in this Cadillac Escalade all the way back and looking at their steering wheel, they can only see the 12th child. And to me, it just drives home, how we are getting to the point where more children, more people are dying on our roadways. Next slide. And then lastly, this is dangerous by design. So this is put out every other year by the Complete Streets Coalition. And this is across the nation, all pedestrian deaths. And so what we see is that Black and Brown communities are overrepresented in pedestrian deaths. And I will say from the research, it's not that the behavior is much different between ethnic groups and race. It comes down to an infrastructure issue. So next slide. So in chapter 4 of my book, I talk about power, influence, and the complexity of people. Next slide. And what I do is I break it down into 4 stakeholders. So there's people in power. Those are our elected leaders. Those are the people who are over our departments of transportation. Those are sometimes our council members, aldermen, depending on where you are and what it's called. Those are the people that have a lot of decision-making power or influence over the people who have that power. So at my role at the city of Houston, I had a lot of power and autonomy to make decisions. And for those that I didn't, I had access to the people in power. In the middle are champions and naysayers. And I know they don't always like to be grouped together, but generally, if you have a public meeting, these are the groups that show up. They're the people who are very passionate about something, or they're very passionate about things not changing. And so that is the biggest group, and their power and influence can change for a variety of different reasons, depending on who they are, depending on who's in office, their power, influence changes. But then there's this group at the bottom, and I call it the silently suffering. Those are the people with low power and low influence, and largely because they're just trying to get through the day. They want to get through the next 24 hours. And once I get through that 24 hours, I'm going to get through the next 24 hours. When I think about the silently suffering, an illustration is during COVID, our transportation system shut down, and rightfully so, because we had this new disease was introduced. We didn't know much about it, and we shut the transportation systems down because people were working from home. And even when we look at the medical system, we praise the doctors, we praise the nurses, and they were absolutely on the front line. But there's a group we left out. We left out the janitorial staff, many of them who were dependent on transit to be able to get to work and didn't have the privilege to be able to just jump in an Uber or take another means or drive in order to get to work. And they were also on the front lines of making sure the hospitals were clean, but often didn't get the same level of praise as the doctors and nurses. When I think about the silently suffering, think about groceries. A lot of us had the privilege of having groceries delivered to our house, but someone had to stock that grocery store, and how did they get to work? Next slide. And so I have a couple of pictures that just illustrate this a little bit more from different places I've been around the country. So this is Tucson, Arizona. This is a ridiculously wide road. Speed limit is, I want to say it was like 45 miles per hour. There is a bike lane on the side of this road. And next slide, there is a person waiting for their child at the bus stop. So this is the type of environments that many kids, many people are living in. And typically, if you see a road like this, it is probably on what we call in the industry the high injury network. And that is the roads where people are frequently being killed and seriously injured. Next slide. We're going to go now to Houston. So this was under my purview. In Houston, by ordinance, sidewalks are the abutting property owner's responsibility. So that becomes a huge expense. It becomes a huge expense for people. In addition, you have the drainage system. And so you're trying to maintain the open ditches. And that also, creates challenges. And so in this photo is a woman who lived in this neighborhood. This is the Sunnyside neighborhood, and having to use a wheelchair in the middle of the street because there is no sidewalks. And so that is the silently suffering. In the next slide, this is a project I worked on in Charleston, South Carolina, where a person is walking to transit. We love to talk about transit. We love to talk about bus rapid transit and all these innovations in transit, but we never think about how does a person get there safely from their home. And so in this case, the person has to walk in the street and then stand in the dirt in order to wait for their bus. And especially when you're talking about in some communities where the buses are only coming every 30 minutes, 45 minutes, sometimes an hour. Next slide. And this photo is what a lot in the industry, some people in the industry would call a complete street, because a complete street is a street that is able to accommodate all users. It does have a really wide sidewalk. It has transit on this street, but it also, this is a typical street that you will see that people are being killed and seriously injured. And part of the reason is, although there is a sidewalk, there's only very little buffer between the edge of the sidewalk and the curb. In these streets, even though there is transit, the transit stops are often not located at a traffic signal. And so what happens is a person is going to run right through the middle of the street because the bus is coming, and that next bus isn't coming for 30, 45 minutes, maybe an hour. And so they're going to go the path of least resistance. And in the newspaper, it'll say the person was not in a marked crosswalk. And largely because to get to that crosswalk, they have to go a half a mile out of their way. And not everybody has the ability to do that. Next slide. So this is just the quick and dirty of how we've designed our systems. Next slide. And I'm going to give you just an overview. So this is called the American Dream. This is the first, clarified definition of the American Dream. And this is from 1931. It says life should be better and richer and fuller for everyone, with opportunity for each according to ability and achievement. And that sounds great. But the next slide. This is, I love to show this because this is my screenshot of my computer that just says American Dream ads. And so this lets you really know who the American Dream was for. If we're talking about 1931, we're right in the middle of the Jim Crow era and segregation and all of those things. And so you have these ads, and typically it is a family, a husband and a wife with a little boy, a little girl. They have an animal, maybe it's a cat, maybe it's a dog. They're either in their house, or they're in their car. Next slide. There's one photo that has people of color in it that I was able to find, and that's this one. It's from 1937. So in the backdrop is this American Dreams ad, world's highest standard of living. There's no way like the American way. And in the foreground, you see people, waiting in a line in order to get food and other things that they need. And so the American Dream was for a very specific part of America. Next slide. So the very short history lesson, and again, I'm picking and choosing dates and times, but the really short segregation timeline. And it's important because this is at the time that our highway system is being designed and built. So 1865 is the end of the Civil War, all that good stuff. 1896, that is the Supreme Court case, Plessy versus Ferguson, Homer Plessy versus Ferguson. By the one-drop rule, Homer Plessy was considered colored, and he was supposed to be going into the colored rail car. And so here you see transportation right at the kind of ground zero of this of segregation, if you will. And so the Supreme Court in 1896 upheld separate but equal doctrine. So that's generally what comes under the umbrella of Jim Crow. In 1954, you have Brown versus Board of Education that quote unquote ended segregation. But we do know, particularly when it comes to transportation, there was still elements of segregation. And so 1964 is when you have the Civil Rights Act that quote unquote really ended segregation, but did it. So in the next slide, But separate from that, you had systemic segregation. In this case, I'm showing a map of Houston. You had redlining, you had protective covenants and deed restrictions. So that still was a way to uphold segregation in many cities of who could live where. And then the next slide, and what's important as we think about all of this, is the definition of white depended on what we were talking about. So from a perspective of whites only, yes, people who were Italian, Polish, maybe even Jewish were considered white. But when it came to deed restrictions and restrictive covenants, many people who were of Irish, Italian, Polish communities were considered not able to live in certain communities. And so I think it's an important context to have, that as we're looking at history, that we're not bringing a 2024 lens to history, that we're actually looking at history in context. And so next slide, all of that is my big buildup. Oh, this is another one from Park Plaza in Charlottesville, also about racial covenants. But next slide. And this is the highway timeline. So you first have the first Federal Aid Road Act in 1916. 1939 is the first time that Congress actually talks about the highway system. So you do have the Federal Aid Act of 1944. And then 1956 is the first time that there is established funding. And what's important about this timeline is that we're still in, the legalized, separate but equal time frame. So next slide. This is a map of 1960 of East Baton Rouge. And so this neighborhood in the 1960s was Black and Italian. And that is why I went through that whole history lesson to get us to this point. So this was a Black and Italian neighborhood. At that time, the state was trying to determine how they were going to do Interstate 10, which now connects from Florida all the way to California through East Baton Rouge. And so like most planners, they were doing these bubble diagrams and highlighting, how they were going to do this. Next slide. But as you zoom in, there's a very important parcel, and that is a parcel that was owned by my family. So the arrow pointing north at the front was a house that was owned by my great-grandmother, and the arrow pointing east was where my grandparents' house was, and that is the house that my mom grew up in. So up until high school, my mother lived in that house. They had to move in order for the building of the interstate. What's interesting about the block is the entire block was basically demolished, and those properties were taken with the exception of my grandmother's house, my great-grandmother's house, and the corner store. Next slide. So as a child, I visited that house. So this is the photo on the left provided by my mom, taken sometime in the late 50s. So this was my great-grandmother's house. For me as a child, I visited my great-grandmother's house that was underneath the interstate, is what we used to joke about. But the fact of the matter of it is, that was that situation. And the photo on the right is what looks like today. So about where the tree is, from there to the sidewalk was where my great-grandmother's house was, and where the post is in the back, that's where my grandparents' house. And I always share this because there's people alive today that remember what it was before the highway was introduced. And as those of you that live and love this transit, world, we also know that as this was happening, many streetcar cities were also destroyed to make way for the automobile, because that was supposed to be part of the American dream. Next slide. And so this is just the view from above, where you can see a lot of those houses on that block are gone. And then to add insult to injury, they created the Expressway Park as a reconnection of the community. Next slide. And so this is my kind of chapter 6 call to action for many of us on here. Next slide. So in my call to action, I give 6 different actions, but one of those, it's just have a bolder vision. And so I'm going to leave you all with some hope. This is just from my travels of different places of what we could do. So first, this is Amsterdam. And this is what Amsterdam will consider a complete street. If you've never been to Amsterdam, I know a lot of people talk about the biking, and that's cool. Remember, I told you I don't really like biking, but that's cool if that's your thing. What impressed me the most about Amsterdam was their transit system. I don't speak any Dutch. I don't read Dutch. Nothing about Dutch resonates with me. But even without knowing the language, the fact that I was able to navigate around the city seamlessly, the fact that I was able to buy a transit ticket very easily, even easier than some US systems that use English. The fact that I was able to get a train, the headways were, every 5 minutes on a Tuesday at like 11 o'clock at night. It was a really great system, and it made it easy to navigate without a car. Next slide. So this is that same street, just zoomed out a little bit. If you remember earlier, I showed you that photo of a complete street. So this is also a complete street. It accommodates everyone. There's a place for people to walk. There's a place for people to drive and even park their cars on the street. There's a place for people to bike, and then you have transit in the middle. And from a kind of right-of-way to right-of-way perspective, it's maybe a little bit narrower of a width, but it was probably about almost the same of that photo that many of the photos that I showed you, it's about the same right of way. So this is what we can do if we just have a bigger, bolder vision. Next slide. I know a lot of people don't always like European examples. This is Cali, Colombia. I know that people talk about Bogota, and I know the former mayor of Bogota loves to talk about Bogota, and Bogota is great, don't get me wrong. But what I really loved was Cali, Colombia. In the United States, we do a bus only lane and we're like cheering like we've done the world's greatest thing. But what's really awesome about Cali, Colombia, it's not just they did a bus only lane, but they did a bus only street. So just using the existing infrastructure that they had, they made the street for bus only. They used one lane to build a transit station. And so, yes, I am that much of a transportation nerd that I sat there and watch people get on and off the bus for about an hour. And so these are the things that we can do with a slightly bolder vision and bolder leadership. And then I'm going to end with this one. So last slide. This is Brussels. It is my favorite European city. I know others have like Paris and London and all that. But this is part of Brussels where the streets are just for pedestrians. And it was really great to be able to navigate without worrying about the sound of cars and all of those things, to be able to sit at a cafe and people watch, because I do love the people watch, and actually be able to look at stores. So this is also what we can do. And there's plenty of places in the United States, and this isn't for everywhere, to be clear, but there's plenty of places that we have in all of our cities that could be pedestrianized, even if it is just for the weekend. But there are a lot of opportunities to do this. And with that, I know we have some Q&A, and I hope that my little one is now occupied and we can have some really great Q&A.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Veronica, for sharing these ideas and your insights. This would be a great time if you have questions, to throw them into the chat and we will get through them. I'll give you guys a minute to get in there. I'm interested in these examples that you shared. Were these big transitions for the cities that they were put into? Like taking a car street and turning it into a pedestrian street?
Absolutely. I'll say particularly for the Amsterdam example, I think for a lot of us, we look at Amsterdam and say, oh, we can never get there. But if you actually go and look at historic photos of Amsterdam, it looks like almost any American city, especially from like the 1970s, 1980s. Just Google those photos of Amsterdam. And you will see it looks like any American city where there's cars everywhere. They're just parked in all random places. It is people that made the decision that we are going to do something different, and we're going to have a different transition. And so with that, Amsterdam just kind of stayed the course this whole time and implemented many of these things. Another great country example, I haven't been there, but I've had an opportunity to meet people from there, and that's Freiburg, Germany. And so that's another example where they just made a decision, we're going to invest in transit. And so what that means is we don't have an expectation that transit makes money, the same way we don't have the expectation that highways make money for us. But they said, we're not going to have an expectation that transit makes money. We're going to build a transit system, and we're going to have the buses come every 10 minutes. Doesn't really matter. We're just going to keep this schedule, and then we're going to simplify the fares. And so now Freiburg, Germany has a 70% mode share for walking, biking, and public transit. But a lot of this comes from leadership being willing to make those hard decisions.
Great. Okay, a question from the chat. Why were cars the American dream? Was there industry lobbying for it or not until much later?
So part of it was the American dream. So there's two things that happen when you have vehicles. So you have the vehicles themselves, and then you had suburbanization, AKA white flight. So part of it was, all right, if we're going to have suburbanization and we want the white people to leave, we have to give them a mechanism to do it. So that's where, if you actually look at American Dream, it's the advertising. Just Google American Dream ads. It really is the advertising around it. There is also a really great documentary called either Cars versus Bike or Bikes versus Cars, one of the two. But it actually talks about, in a lot of cities, the car manufacturers that are part of the reason of the decline of the streetcar systems that we had in many of our cities. So if a lot of it, like most things in the US, come down to lobbying, money, advertising, all of those things.
Okay. And it does seem that a lot of the US at least puts a lot of their investment, transportation investment in cars and highways as opposed to public transportation. But there's another question from the chat. Actually, are there any US cities that you think have led the way or are doing really interesting initiatives to start to transition away from that car focus?
Yeah, I have my sleeper cities. I know a lot of people will look to, I think DC's doing a great job. And largely it's DC can't move a curb line. So they have no choice but to start really thinking of how do we repurpose what we have. So I think DC is doing a pretty good job. And there's other smaller cities like Seattle that is also doing a great job. But they always get a lot of love. If you go to Streets blog, they're always on there. I will say Minneapolis is like this sleeper city that's doing some really awesome things, both around transit, around biking. I believe they've been like the #1 biking city for several years in a row, which is unexpected, I think, for many of us because it's Minneapolis. But I will say, having been there, it is probably one of the easier cities to actually navigate if you're coming into the airport. So getting from the airport to downtown, it's actually probably one of the easiest to navigate and understand in the United States. And they're just plugging along. And also they're really thinking about their zoning, which, becomes a challenge in a lot of cities in terms of affordability. And then they're also really making sure to bring along their art program. The other city I will say that I have my eye on is Nashville. They have a new mayor, and they are trying to get a referendum now to get more transit, walking, biking. And their campaign is called Choose How You Move. But they've actually done a lot around that. And then I think a city to watch is going to be LA. They just did a referendum to actually fund mobility, walking, biking, transit, and the people have spoken on that one.
Yeah, that's interesting because I'm from LA and I just know of it as such a car culture. And every time I go back, I see more bike lanes. They now have the kind of metro rail, but it still feels like it hasn't quite come together. It doesn't quite have maybe the buy-in from everybody.
I think it's one of those, it hasn't come together yet, but it will. I mean, HLA passed with 63%. So it's not a huge majority, but it is a good enough a number of people that want something different. So I think it'll be interesting to see over the next 10 years how, if LA is able to continue that momentum, what that city will look like.
Okay, great. Have e-bikes, mopeds, things like that helped or hurt? Is there any way to integrate them into cities safely, especially as they're starting to really take over bike lanes and get really kind of in the mix of our traffic?
So I'm going to start with e-bikes first. I think e-bikes are fabulous. I know that there's some challenge, and I know in New York, I've seen some of the challenges that you all have had. I think e-bikes are great, and the data is showing that e-bikes are great. So number one, e-bikes, particularly with older adults, it is helping them become more active. Here in Houston, there is a Texas-based e-bike company, and they have a retail office not far from my house. And these old people like get together and have their little bike rides and like meetups and all of that. What the data is showing is that people who have e-bikes are overall more active and they are getting the health benefits of e-bikes. So I absolutely think there is a place. My hope is as they become more popular, that the cost comes down because they are still very expensive. Even, for cargo bikes, there are many families that are making the choice for the cargo bike to be the second car, but they're still $5,000-$6,000, for the base model, cheaper than a car, but still very expensive. So I am hoping, and I know that there's a big push as there's, rebates and all the vouchers and all this stuff for EV electric cars, that can also extend to electric bicycles. And I think that there's a place for them. As it relates to mopeds, they take up less space. I think the challenge of mopeds is where do they belong? Do they belong in the bike lane, or do they belong with mixed traffic? And so I think that as they grow in popularity, us as an industry need to just start having a conversation of what type of lane, or how big should the bike lane be, or how big should the mobility lane be? Do we start to then separate out the mopeds from the e-bikes and regular bikes? So I think those are all conversations to grapple with. But I think that anything that takes up less space is always going to be a good thing because space is finite.
Great. Here's another question from the chat. What sort of policies should cities adopt in terms of development to support more inclusive transportation infrastructure? So we have an influx of car-centered businesses in Northwest Arkansas, car washes, drive-throughs, which have created more entrances on roads, making the sideways harder to navigate.
So I'll say this, I think as it relates to, there's a lot of policies that can be put in place. Something as simple as, and we did this in Houston, for major thoroughfares, we don't allow curb cuts. And that's basically, where you get your driveway entrances. We don't allow them off of major roads. Now there might some legacy ones, and so legacy ones are grandfathered in. But as long as the property has another option, they can't have a curb cut off of the major thoroughfare. And so then what that does is it reduces the amount of conflicts between people walking and people driving. The other thing I know that a lot of us grapple with in the industry is the land use side of it. Land use and transportation are very linked, but I'll be very honest. The two industries, we talk a good game, but we don't really work together in how we need to. And some of that comes down to funding. And I know that the Housing and Urban Development and US DOT are trying to figure out how to make federal funding work together. But then you end up with this chicken and egg and who goes first. So that is always a challenge. But I think zoning is a major challenge. There's a good book also by a fellow Island Press author called Arbitrary Lines by M. Nolan Gray that talks about different cities and their different policies around land use and how that has helped or hurt their transportation network. But those are just kind of, 2-3 things off my head that I can think of that help us get to just overall better outcomes.
Okay, great. Another question from the chat. So I guess part of inclusive transportation is really taking into account people with differing needs, especially like accessibility and disabilities. What cities do you think are doing well with accessibility for people with disabilities? We're working a lot here in New York. There's still a lot of room to grow in that area.
I don't really think any city's doing a good job, if I'm being honest. I mean, even in Houston, we hosted the National Federation of the Blind, and it was a big push to get all of our signals in downtown and around the convention center and around where many of the attendees would be staying to be accessible pedestrian signals. And so that's where people can press the button and they can hear, you know, the walk sign is on to cross and it has the name of the street. But overall, I think every city's doing a poor job, if I'm being really honest. And partly it's the Americans with Disability Act doesn't really have the teeth that it needs to have to get us to where we need to go. You know, even, you know, with sidewalks and curb ramps, you don't really have to upgrade them unless you're touching that road. So if you are doing a street rehab, then yeah, you have to go fix the curb ramp. Other than that, there's no like mechanism to go do it. All cities were supposed to have a transition plan. And so we all know the ADA Act is of 1990 and many cities still don't have their transition plan. So in the United States, I can't really think of any offhand that are doing a good job. I can't think of any offhand that are doing a great job.
That is definitely unfortunate. I know that you said that, you know, it takes strong leadership to really put some of these more kind of progressive plans in place. But it seems like also cars are mainly the culprit for a lot of the problems that we're seeing, and people love their cars. So how do you also convince people to support the kind of leadership that's going to move these plans forward?
So I'll say this, and I talk about this in my book, you got to build your leadership, like full stop, you know, and some of that comes down to when it comes to elections, we can get so focused on the presidential election, but what are we doing to build the pipeline of leadership? Who do you have for mayor? You know, all the mayors, their terms come to an end at some point. Who are you running for mayor, for council member, for zoning commission, planning commission, school board? All of those things become important. And I will say it's not about people not using their car. It's about giving people as many options as possible. Because the reality is, if you give people a lot of options, some are going to choose not to drive. They're going to be like, you know what? Why am I going to drive? It's going to be a headache. Let me just go ahead and take the train, or let me go ahead and bike. And so it's about giving people as many options as possible, and just making sure to, you know, elect people that have that same vision and thinking, because it's hard.
Yeah, it also seems like it's a big cost that has to be invested.
And not really, though. I think that there is, because I will say, like in working in DC, so they basically have a policy, you can't move the curb line out. But even without moving the curbs, there's a lot you can do within the curb to reallocate space. And we see this all the time. I know you all have some examples in New York where you have taken a space and made, you know, a bike lane or made a bus lane. So oftentimes that's just using what's already there, and it's not terribly expensive. And opportunities to even do them as demonstration projects, just using, you know, $55 can of spray chalk.
It's true. I actually benefit from having a select bus service line that helps me really get through the traffic in the morning, which is beyond helpful. Another question from the chat. What are some first steps in helping a community with very minimal existing transit? A well-connected transit network takes time, and many residents who need cars to live are resistant to the reduction of car infrastructure. I guess kind of along the same lines. You know, what's a good place to start?
You know, a good place to start is, can people even just access the existing, you know, infrastructure? I think sometimes have a bold vision. Absolutely. I'm going to always support a bold vision. And sometimes it can seem overwhelming of like, okay, but how do we get there? There's existing transit. Can you get to your existing transit? And the answer is probably no. And so some of that is working with your local jurisdiction on, can we just get sidewalks to get people there safely? Is there lighting so that when people are coming home late at night, that they feel safe because it's bright and they can be seen? I know that there is federal funding for that type of you know, infrastructure specific to people walking and biking to get the transit. So to me, it's like that is the easy kind of low hanging fruit. even bus stops. Okay, so I get to the bus stop. We have a sidewalk to the bus stop. Is there a bus shelter? Is there a place to sit? Is there a garbage can that I can toss out this banana that I've been eating on my way to the bus stop? You know, all of those things to me are very kind of low-hanging fruit that help make transit better for people and give people the option to use what is already there.
Great. Okay, there's another question here from the chat. The area I live in is experiencing a lot of rapid growth, and rural undeveloped land is being developed faster than cities can develop the standards needed to plan for inclusive transportation. Many of our main roads are highways that are owned by the Department of Transportation and not the cities. So improvements to the roads depend on the DOT. What advice do you have with engaging DOT to embrace inclusive transportation infrastructure?
Oh my gosh. You know, I'll say this. It all starts with just sitting down with your Department of Transportation. I know is not all, they're not all the same. But really sitting down with them, because there are opportunities, especially when you're talking about rapidly growing areas and you're building new roadways. We know that we don't have to do it how we've always done it. And usually what happens is for these outer lying areas, it starts off as maybe a 2-lane road with open ditch on the side, and then it gets expanded to a 4-lane road, and next you know it's a big old, you know, highway situation. But there are opportunities in the beginning to work with your DOT to say, we get it, this is a limited access highway, but can we have pedestrian infrastructure? Can we have places where we can get across the street? It doesn't always have to be this thing. The other thing I can say is reach out to the Complete Streets Coalition. They actually have training. So if you can get your advocacy groups together, so the pictures that I have from Tucson, it was because the advocacy groups got together and said, we need to get our DOT up to speed. And they brought, you know, me down and a few other experts to sit and work with, you know, the city, the state, the county, to help them see that there's a new vision. Because oftentimes, I'll be honest, a lot of these, in a lot of places, you know, the engineers don't get training outside of the basic kind of what they've learned. And so it is a retraining. So I will say that too, if you can get an advocacy group together and bring the Complete Street Coalition and do a training and bring the leaders of your DOT, of your county, and say, hey, look, this is what we can do, and we would like to see this here. The other thing is there are other state DOTs. They're not all created equal, but Washington DOT does have some examples. So see if you can even get a peer exchange going. And also just a lot of prayer, if I'm being honest.
Okay, great. Another question from the chat. New York is seeing a lot more open streets kind of initiatives that shut down blocks for just pedestrians, and sometimes adding in programming in the last few years. Is this happening elsewhere? Is this kind of a broader movement?
It is a broader movement, especially during COVID when, you know, people, well, COVID didn't go away, but at the beginning of COVID, I should say, it was happening. Oh, there you go. WashDOT is here. Hey, see? Oh, sorry, distracted by the chat. But yeah, there are other cities that are doing it. I know that DC has done it a few times. They may have you know, typically do it as a day, but other cities are doing it. In Houston, believe it or not, we called it More Space Main Street, where we have a main street. There is a rail line in the middle, and then there's lanes on either side for vehicles. But we have shut them down semi-permanently for the restaurants to be able to expand into that part of the street. And so they essentially are now non-car streets. And so that program is being expanded. So that is happening. So additional streets will be shut down to vehicles, for restaurants, for people to walk around. So there are other cities that are doing that as well.
That's great to know. So I think that's kind of wrapped up the questions in our chat. If there's any few left, you could probably throw it in really quickly. I know you kind of said that you were in the call to action that you were seen fairly optimistic findings. Like, what is that your take? Do you feel optimistic about kind of the future of transportation?
Absolutely. I think with the bipartisan infrastructure law, we have seen, I know it sounds like cliche, like this is a once of a lifetime or once in generation funding, but we are really seeing, once in generation funding where um, it is going to what we call areas of persistent poverty, where likely people are dying because we haven't had any road transit investment there. The fact that the federal government is giving money directly to cities for safety projects is huge. The fact that the federal government is giving funding to cities directly for reconnecting communities, and also transit agencies. So I think that in the next year or so, as these shovels start going in the ground and these projects start getting built, I'm really optimistic about what that begins to look like. I will say, even in Texas, high-speed rail is moving. It has cleared a lot of the legal hurdles. And so I do think high-speed rail is going to be a thing that continues to, inch forward and hopefully gets to be high speed. But I am very optimistic.
Okay, great. And actually, one other question came in that I think is probably a good one to take us out on. It was your advice for someone entering university now to study with the hopes of doing this kinds of transportation work later on. Do you have any advice for that next group of engineers?
Absolutely. So, and okay, and do you want to be on camera since you're? um, okay. Sorry, you all. I am solo parenting, and we are just trying to hold it together. Okay. All right. So I'm going to try to answer this question as quickly as possible. I will say the biggest advice I have for engineers is definitely do a multidiscipline degree. So do engineering, do urban planning so that you can understand how these things fit together. I also took a class in anthropology, which was extremely helpful for me and my profession to understand people and how to understand culture and learn how to break that down. But I'm happy to connect on LinkedIn if you have more questions. I absolutely think you should go to University of Maryland, College Park. I think it's the greatest school ever.
Well, there you have it. Thank you so much, Veronica, for coming and sharing your book and your findings and your research. And I hope all of you will go check out the book, kind of read more into this, learning more about what's happening, and getting inspired for what could happen in our cities. So I wanted to just thank you all for coming today and joining us. Thank you for some great questions. Again, we'd love to see you at the museum. We are open from Thursday through Sunday from 10 a.m. to 4 p.m. You can register in advance. We are continuing to host online programs and bringing back a lot of on-site programs. If you would like to support this work, consider making a donation. I'd love to let you know about a couple upcoming events that are happening. Next week, we have two programs. We're hosting a virtual exhibit walkthrough of telling transit stories at our Grand Central Gallery space. This is going to be with museum curator Jody Shapiro on Tuesday, May 21st at 2 p.m. So that's free and online. We are also hosting a live program at the museum on Thursday, May 23rd. So this will be at 6 p.m. This is Change at Jamaica, celebrating 190th anniversary of the Long Island Railroad. This is going to be a really great program. It's a really fascinating history. I didn't realize before getting involved in that program how much the Long Island Railroad really shaped the development of New York. So it's fascinating, and you can come out and join us at the museum. So we hope to see you there, or see you online, or see you out in the system. Have a great rest of your evening and a great weekend. Thanks all for coming.